Welcome everybody to our first panel of the morning. I'm glad to see everybody here. This panel is called The Contagion of Hope. I'll read you the description briefly. Even as the global commons suffer from states' failure to reach international agreement on climate change, a groundswell of innovation in cities, among civil society organizations, and in the private sector is inspiring new faith in our ability to live more sustainably. This panel describes how stakeholders are uniting to build smart energy communities, how social entrepreneurs have crafted win-win ways to manage resources, how finance is adapting to and influencing a new environmental landscape, and what initiatives like theirs augur for the future. To moderate the panel, we've asked our good friend Joël Thibert. Joël is a Trudeau Scholar, an expert in sustainable urban development, and a Montreal associate of McKinsey & Company.
Bon matin à toutes et à tous. Très heureux d'être ici ce matin. I will try and jump right into the conversation, but before I do that, I do want to introduce our distinguished guests. It's a very interesting and very hopefully thought-provoking panel we'll have this morning. So we have Jean Embitcher, who basically is head of responsible investment for Mercer Consulting, has various other achievements, but you can discover them because the bios are all included in the program. We have Tzipora Berman, who's whose livelihood is to design and win environmental campaigns. She's a mastermind behind a lot of campaigns that you probably know. She recently wrote a book, The Crazy Times, by Random House, just received a doctorate, honorary doctorate from UBC. So also a distinguished activist. And then we also have Brent Gilmore, who's a planner, as am I, so we're fellow MCIP members, or Guinean Institute of Planner members. Brent is actually executive director of Quest, which is Quality Urban Energy Systems of Tomorrow, exactly, which basically looks at adaptation and mitigation in cities, and so it fits right into the subject of this morning's session. And Mr. Harker couldn't be here. He has the flu and he's in bed. So Brent has stepped in last minute, and I think his expertise will speak very well to the topic of this morning. Before I go in with the first question, I want to say something because I was sitting where you were sitting for many years as a scholar, and then before that I went to the conferences, and those few times where I felt that I was kind of left with some hunger, où je suis resté sur mon appétit, I guess would be the French expression, after these, is when I feel like we tiptoed around the issue and didn't kind of ask the hard questions. So I would ask you, and I will commit to also doing that, to only asking hard questions, because these are important topics and difficult topics and important, in difficult times, and so I would encourage us all to really, be very candid and forthright. And so the first question has to do with cities. Cities have grown over the last 2 years faster and on a larger scale than ever before. And cities, of course, are facing more than just climate change. They're facing many other challenges, including many environmental hazards, air pollution, water pollution, but many other things as well. And so, you could say cities are in a tough spot. On the other hand, cities are still places of hope. People move to cities in search of something better, and that's widely true across the globe. And if World Bank reports in the last couple of years have kind of showed very convincingly that urban dwellers are doing better than the people that kind of they left behind. And so there's this interesting tension between cities becoming places with a lot of problems, but also places of hope. In this context, in the context of climate change, there are these tensions between mitigation and adaptation. Cities are asked to do more to mitigate, climate change, but there also is an urgent need for many of them to adapt. And so for many people, climate change isn't some problem in the future, it's happening right now. So I guess my question, it's a three-part question, but the question is really, how are they dealing with this? What kinds of mechanisms are they putting in place, whether it's financial or governance, and are these mechanisms scalable? Because I think that's a really important question. It's one thing to say, there's all this innovation, but is this innovation something that can be scaled up? So maybe you can start with Brent.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me preface and start the response this morning with it's not an either-or for adaptation or mitigation. I'll use the term here, cities are in a bit of a sweet spot, if you like the idea of hope. And here's why. 60% of our energy end use occurs in communities, and 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions also occur in communities, meaning they're extremely well placed to respond. They're also potentially the source for a good portion of these issues as well. I want to draw an example for you quickly here. We often refer to, and you've heard in the introductions on smart energy communities, what I like to say and what cities need, I think, going forward is a framework that allows us to tackle mitigation and adaptation at the same time while addressing the growing and substantial infrastructure costs that our communities are experiencing, not just here in Canada, but globally. And I think smart energy communities can help do that. They provide that framework. They can help improve energy efficiency, enhance reliability, cut costs, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So who's doing that? How is it happening right now? Let me give you an example. Region of York actually did a very comprehensive climate change and adaptation plan. Why was it a good example? When you have to think about looking at climate change and adaptation mitigation, it really is at the local level. You've heard a lot about that even last night in terms of the presentation that was given. But it means reaching out to a really broad base of stakeholders. A lot of different parties get impacted, but they're also part of the solution. When you looked at the region of York, it had to cover pretty big bases. It had to think about the water impact, the health impact. It also had to think about the energy impact, etc. What was useful, though, is to start to realize that forming these partnerships at the local level could actually give them a constructive and effective response to climate change and mitigation. Specifically, they started looking at how they could harness and reduce the reliance on energy for pumping and treatment of water. Just to give you a little example here for you. Mostly across Canada, roughly, about 60%, give or take, of the electricity costs for a municipality is spent on the pumping and treatment of water. That's huge. That's a significant amount of energy being used. And it's a great place to start for thinking about how you can think about adaptation mitigation, both in terms of reduction on the energy use, but also in terms of the amount of water that you're using at the same time. That's a good part in response. The other example I just want to give here, I think, is even communities like Toronto. And there's some representation here today as well. I think Eleanor McIntyre is here. And the Tower Renewal Program is a good example too. But let me start with deep lake water cooling. How many people here are familiar with deep lake water cooling by a show of hands? Okay, that's a good amount of you. For those who aren't aware, the City of Toronto is a world leader in that. They have reached out and were able to successfully, through a corporation at the time, Enwave, partner and extend a mile-long pipe into Lake Ontario. That pipe provides fresh water. That fresh water is actually being brought into the system for quite a wide area of the GTA. But what's really important about that is they are able to extract, if you like, for air conditioning purposes, the coolness out of that water, and therefore take a number of buildings who would have had to have, if you like, a really big compressor and use a lot of energy for chilling purposes. They no longer have to. It's also significantly reduced the amount of water that they have to use for cooling towers. So it's a win-win. It was a win for providing effectively, in this case, fresh water that was needed. It was also a win for reducing the amount of energy consumption that quite a few buildings, I'm going to get the number wrong, at least 100 now I think, are on that system, plus in the downtown core. And it's the single largest greenhouse gas reduction initiative for the City of Toronto at one shot. Pretty impressive example of just what we're doing now and why cities, I think, have an opportunity to respond that way.
Okay. Jean, would you like to comment?
Great, sure.
Yeah.
So I guess I work with investors, so I come at this from a little bit of a different angle. And investors don't tend to, think about investing in cities per se. They think about investing in different types of investment asset classes. So they would invest in fixed income, bonds, equities, real estate, infrastructure. And of course, all of those areas are connected to cities, often in one way or another. So there may be municipal debt. And many of you will have heard about green bonds, which is a relatively new phenomenon around different issuers, whether they're companies or provinces. And in fact, the province of Ontario issued, I think, Canada's first provincial green bond recently around sustainable transportation. So green bonds are definitely a new innovation which are helping to enable kind of more green technology, green infrastructure. In the equity markets, there are a growing number of companies all around the world who are providing solutions around low carbon technologies and a transition to a cleaner environment, a cleaner ecosystem that companies or that investors are getting access to. And in fact, there are a number of new services and research providers who are able to track and allocate corporate revenue to determine the extent to which any company is part of the new economy versus kind of the old economy. So investors are starting to use those types of analytics to figure out where their portfolios are positioned. So there's some really interesting innovation in that sense. And then of course, direct infrastructure investing into real estate, into roads, into all kinds of different direct investments are things that investors are exposed to, actually increasingly exposed to, because the kind of long-term investment horizon of infrastructure type assets are often attractive to long-term large investors. So what's the relationship between some of those assets and sustainability, climate risk, climate opportunity? Those are conversations that are increasingly taking place.
Okay. So I think those are really interesting elements to the answer. Maybe we'll sort of touch upon the same question later on in the discussion. Let us move to another hard question, maybe harder even, hopefully, about fossil fuels. Sort of, directly about that. The fossil fuel divestment movement is gaining traction. It's something that is getting more and more press. And while that is happening, the carbon pricing idea is also gaining acceptance. As we now know, Preston Manning, Paul Hankson, such characters are now speaking in favor of carbon pricing. So there's clearly things are changing in sort of people's mindsets when they think about oil and sort of carbon fossil fuels in general. Yet, as we all know, oil exploration is continuing apace. Oil supplies seem to be not diminishing but increasing, and so the peak oil 10 years ago was still very much talked about as this kind of looming disaster. It seems like it's getting further and further away. Maybe we are in the midst of it, but if that's the case, then obviously the predictions didn't come to pass. And so, two things. First, for Jane, how do you advise your clients relative to that very specific issue? For instance, if some jurisdictions have adopted carbon pricing, is that something that comes into account when sort of making investment decisions for the better, whether as a plus or as a minus? How does that influence people's thinking about investment? And so maybe it would start with that, but also linked to this, and this question for Tzipora in particular, what are the chances that oil will actually be become a stranded asset? Is that happening? Is there kind of, what is the time horizon for that to happen? And what needs to be true for that to be true?
Right, so this is a very big question and
Yes.
Obviously a very topical issue in Canada, but even more so in some other regions where there are even more high-profile campaigns going on. We recently wrote a paper called "To Divest or Not to Divest is Not the Right Question." The question is, what risks and opportunities do climate change pose to your assets, and how are you thinking about those? Are you managing the risk? Are your external fund managers, if you're managed externally through different third-party providers, and the companies you're investing in, or the different types of assets you're investing in, how are they managing climate risk? Are they thinking about the potential introduction of different carbon pricing? Are they using different scenarios in their different valuations? Are they reporting to you on how they're managing these risks? So, what kind of dialogue is taking place around that? And I think we're at a very, very interesting kind of point in time when, finance and climate are coming together to think about how these two things are related tomorrow, next year, in 10 years, and in 100 years. And they are definitely related, but historically they've been separate fields, they've been separate issues. So we are currently in this amazing period of research and innovation and progress around thinking about these risks and opportunities. And so that's what we advise our clients on in terms of, do you have different investment beliefs around, how these different issues may progress over time, and about the relationship between climate risk factors, whether they're physical impacts that are going to impact your real estate or your infrastructure, policy impacts, so the different introduction of carbon pricing mechanisms over different times in different jurisdictions, and technology advancement. And so a huge growth opportunity in terms of trying to tap into and get access to. So how are you thinking about those climate-related risk factors? And how are you implementing them? And then how are you reporting on them?
Okay.
So it's a bigger conversation than, are you invested in fossil fuels?
So it's about sort of raising some of these issues so that they're top of mind for your clients. So, Zipra, about the stranding of the asset.
It's interesting. I met Robert Reich yesterday, last night. He's many of you know, economist, a former U.S. Secretary of Labor. And he asked me what I was working on, and I said, I'm working on oil sands issues, and I'm working on climate change issues. And he said, what's Canada doing? This is so crazy. It's so clear tar sands are going to become a stranded asset. And that was the first thing out of his mouth, which I thought was interesting in terms of where the conversation is right now. So let's back up a bit. What are stranded assets? How do they relate to Canada? The essential idea is that when we align government policies with the 2-degree commitment that was made by our own government, and many others in Copenhagen, then essentially what happens is the majority of the remaining fossil fuels are stranded assets. So I think to look at it by the numbers, the best analysis out there is by the Potsdam Institute, and their calculations are that between 2000 and 2050, the world has a carbon budget of about 886 gigatons of carbon. So that's for the whole world. That's what we can use if we're trying to keep the world below 2 degrees at climate safe levels. And if you minus what we've already used, that leaves us at 565 gigatons of carbon for the next 36 years globally. And where the concept of stranded assets comes from, of course, is that we already value on the markets 5 times that. So we're currently valuing in the marketplace 5 times what we can safely burn in a 2-degree world. So what does that mean for Canada? Well, oil sands that are currently valued on the market are about 250 gigatons of carbon. So that's almost half what the entire world can safely burn. So if you look at oil sands expansion, we already have permitted about 5 million barrels a day. That is well to wheels, 1,760 megatons of carbon. So we hear a lot right now in Canada that our emissions are small compared to what's happening in the rest of the world, that we don't have a big climate impact. So 1,760 megatons of carbon is more than the combined emissions of 150 nations. So if we get to that level of production, then at that point, oil sands exceed the emissions of all U.S. coal production. I think that's why we're seeing concern around the world. So then, okay, so that's the numbers and the likelihood. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, now governor of the Bank of England 2 weeks ago in New York, said that it's very clear now that the majority of the world's oil reserves need to stay in the ground. That, in fact, 2/3 of the remaining fossil fuels need to stay in the ground. Now, Mark Carney's not a West Coast hippie. In fact, Mark Carney doesn't actually say anything unless he's trying to send a signal to the marketplace. And so I think that is a signal about likelihood. I think the other ones we've seen are, the changes we've seen in the last month are so rapid. The fact is, social change isn't linear. And at the point that government policies align with 2 degrees, then yes, the majority of Canada's oil sands become stranded assets. And the initial response from many oil companies has been pie in the sky, it's not going to happen. Essentially the conversation we need to be having in Canada is about pace and scale. Because we need to figure out how much, how quickly, and how are we aligning with global climate policies and markets. So we have seen in the last 2 weeks the China-US climate deal. In the last month, we've seen $50 billion worth of investment divesting from oil and coal. We've seen 1,000 companies in 73 countries, along with the World Bank, call for a price on carbon. And that's in the last 60 days. So I think, and we've also seen that, I think the final point I'll make is about social license and risk. So the fact is, to a certain extent, projects in the oil sands, new projects, are already stranded. We've seen Total shelve an $11 billion project. We've seen Shell, we've seen Statoil, and every single one of them referred to uncertainty because of pipeline capacity and rising concerns. There's a new report just out 2 weeks ago by the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, where they say civil society concerns, the lawsuits and the protests have now cost the oil sands industry $17 billion in lost revenue in the last couple of years, and $30 billion if you add transportation bottlenecks. So when you look at the safety concerns of exploding trains and leaky pipes to water issues, eminent domain issues, the muzzling of scientists, democracy issues, health, social justice, treaty rights, in some respects, I think what we're looking at is a perfect storm related to community concerns and citizens' engagement on this issue. And I think the fact is that as long as government is not going to step in and address these issues, then we're going to see those concerns continue to rise. And I think we're starting to see the policy environment, the market conditions, and the technological advances, and I think civil society engagement that will lead to policies aligning with 2 degrees.
If I may piggyback on that very quickly, right? We have all sort of looked at the news. American Congress is going to change very, very quickly. So there is a Senate decision, yes, that kind of said no to Keystone, but that may very well be reversed in the next few months. If that were the case, does that change the calculation you just described? Because in many ways, what I hear from you is governments need to align, right? The alignment needs to come from governments partly. If the government, of the world's sort of largest, most powerful nation economically, changes that decision on Keystone specifically, how does that change the calculation that we need to make here, or how we approach the issue entirely?
I think we will see President Obama veto Keystone. It's not in line with the legacy he wants to leave and the commitments that he's made on climate. And despite the industry's somewhat desperate attempts to say that pipelines have nothing to do with expansion, we don't need these pipelines unless we're planning on dramatically expanding the oil sands. All of their own reports and business cases say that for the pipelines. And so I don't think that Keystone will go through. If it does, then I think you're right. I think it sets us back in the conversation. Because the fact is that we need to be having a conversation about how fast, I believe in the oil sands we should be having a conversation about capping current production, how we clean it up, and how we transition out. And that starts to put Canada's economy and investments in line with what's happening around the world and our 2-degree commitments. I don't think there is any way to build new fossil fuel infrastructure like those pipelines that lead to expansion of some of the most high carbon fuels on the planet in a responsible way in the climate era.
And maybe one additional question, which any of you can really address. So we heard Chad Briggs talk to us last night about crisis and how unfortunately crisis is often the starting point of the changes that you describe. So you talk about a perfect storm, which hasn't quite morphed into a crisis yet. You seem confident that that's all the elements you named will be sufficient to kind of get us aligned with these the 2% commitment. So what's your feeling, Jane and Brent? Do you feel that it's enough, that we've come to this tipping point, or that are we going to need a crisis for real action to take place?
I mean, just weighing in on the investor perspective, I think the investment community and finance as a global stakeholder historically, has been underrepresented, I think, in a lot of the development of kind of international policy negotiations and different codes and conventions on any number of issues historically. It's actually really interesting to see. You often read a lot of political science literature talking about 3 key stakeholders in, in any kind of major topic: government, business, and
Yes.
civil society. And the financial community historically hasn't really been brought in or thought about in a lot of kind of major issues. And this is an issue where, investors are definitely getting more engaged. And I think while everyone would benefit from a more clear policy signal in terms of being able to, do long-term planning, whether it's companies or investors, I think we shouldn't underestimate the influence of shareholders in engaging with companies that they're invested in. So we've seen a lot of interesting engagements in North America and other parts of the world on this topic, and it is leading to increased disclosure by companies around, their view on whether some of their assets will be stranded. And so, Exxon and Shell are some high-profile cases where investors have reached out and tried to start that dialogue. And a few weeks ago, RBC hosted, I think, Canada's first discussion on the carbon bubble and stranded assets, and with Suncor and Pembina, and it was a fantastic event with a lot of discussion around these issues. And I think one of the key takeaways for me was this notion of thinking about oil sands and fossil fuel companies as mature industries rather than growth industries.
Interesting.
And, the truth is we need fossil fuels, and our energy mix, while it does need to evolve, is still going to have a big portion of fossil fuels in them, right, in terms of our energy, our power mix, and our transportation fuels. And so how do we reduce the carbon associated with those? How do we bring other types of energy into that mix more quickly? Those are critical discussions. And how do we manage the reserves of fossil fuels that we do need to access, and think about, the energy sector, the fossil fuel investment as more of a mature industry than a growth industry. So that was a really interesting takeaway. And what are the implications of that? And then you get into all kinds of questions around, executive compensation and incentives within those industries. If the focus is on growth rather than on managing existing reserves, those are very different business models. So there a lot of different questions came up at that event, which I think are very, very topical and interesting, and really kind of moving this discussion forward from, this kind of, high-profile debate to something that's more practical in terms of, okay, well, where do we go from here?
I was just going to add, I think that was a good overview of where things might be headed. When you take it down a little further for us from the broader policy national debate, and you go straight down to a community, they have already been addressing climate change and thinking about how to mitigate and adapt for quite a long period of time. But I wanted to pick up on the equity point and the investment opportunities. That is where we're starting to see dramatic change right across Canada too. What does that mean? I'll give you an example. City of Guelph, just in the southern part here of Ontario, had opted to create a whole new holding company in order to implement and move forward with its community energy plan, if you like, how it was going to address greenhouse gas emission reductions as well. The result, it realized that this was a new business direction, an opportunity to help secure the direction and employment opportunities for that community as much as it was trying to address the issues of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. So where and how we think about the evolution of and the impact of climate change is really driving a new way of thinking about business too, and how you can make good, strategic, solid investments. Another good example is in Vancouver, and I'll just pick up on a developer there, Ian Gillespie with West Bank, I think. Specifically, what they did is they actually bought the Vancouver District Energy System. Now, why is that a good thing, and what have they done with it? Well, they're going to go ahead and build, and they're going to build quite a few buildings. And why I just wanted to put this out there is the developer chose to build their own energy company. And that company was running a fairly, what I would call, conventional energy system. Hot water system, steam, not very efficient. But what they've committed to was to make it both hot water and also, with time, hopefully, move to a biomass-oriented fueled system. Why that's interesting? It became an equity opportunity. They get to own their own energy system and also try and advance that with their development at the same time. So the business world and how they're investing, even at the local level now, is changing. So it all adds up. I just wanted to draw that connection for people a little bit here today.
So it's very interesting to hear that the financial community is maybe the source of hope in this debate. And speaking about that, I'd like to speak about, or ask you about, not speak about, but ask you about the role of ENGOs, so environmental NGOs. We know that obviously many of them have been working on this issue for quite a while. I mean, there's, I think, representatives of Équiterre here today who are, in Quebec, are very vocal about this. They have a reputation for integrity, most of them, that few businesses even enjoy. At the same time, in recent months, years, they've been accused of demonizing free enterprise, and there's a bit of a, or whether it's perceived or real, a bit of a polarization, I guess, where we sort of pit the ENGOs against oil and gas companies and other companies. Yet what I hear from you, Jane, and is that maybe there's a lot more room for partnership, and perhaps between ENGOs and the financial community, because there seems to be a sort of fact-based discourse there, which is I think a kind of common interest and a common point of reference. So I'm wondering first, what role should they play? So maybe that's a question for Tsipora, obviously, since you advise many of them. Should they be partners? Should they be watchdogs? Should they do both things at the same time? And can we imagine them working more closely with businesses and perhaps with the financial community? What kinds of partnerships can we imagine? And hopefully we'll get to that part. What are the implications of that for Northern Gateway in particular? So, can we imagine a situation where it becomes less of a you'd say, entrenched war and more of a collaborative problem solving between ENGOs, First Nations communities, but also the financial and business community? Sure.
So I think we make a mistake when we lump all environmental groups together as though they're the same thing, because they're certainly not. There are different theories of change, there are different goals, there are different skills and tactics. Some will be partners, some will be watchdogs. But I have in the past done a lot of work to create industry environmental group collaborations. The Great Bear Rainforest Agreement in British Columbia with 4 logging companies and several environmental groups, the Canadian Boreal Forest Initiative across the country. So because of that history, a lot of folks from the oil industry have been coming and saying, okay, can we create this, some kind of similar ENGO industry collaboration, and now that you've moved from blockades to boardrooms. But I think one thing we need to remember is that the companies who reached agreements to protect huge areas of forest in this country over the last 20 years and changed their forest practices did that because of the blockades and the boycotts, because they had to address the issues. Change is difficult, especially when it's changing the entire system, the bottom line of many companies. I think it's essential that we see more, not only groups, but civil society engagement in the streets on climate change and on these issues. And I think that will start to bring some of the urgency to the issue that we're going to need to see collaborative environments. But I think we will and are seeing some great conversations and collaborations, but I think but in the absence of government and industry identifying climate as the problem that needs to be solved, I think we're going to continue to see NGOs and First Nations, building the power to ensure that they do. On Gateway, I would say, I don't think there's any way to make that new infrastructure okay, as long as the systemic issues of climate and pace and scale and human rights haven't been addressed. I mean, in a lot of ways, I feel terrible for those folks at Enbridge, because they're stuck in between the issues that are upstream on climate and pace and scale and water and toxics, etc., and the spills and oil tankers and issues that are downstream. I don't think there's a way to make it right, but I also think it's the wrong question. The question is not what are the conditions under which a pipeline can go forward, but what are the policies that we need in the oil sands to ensure our air and water and treaty rights are protected and pace and scale is addressed, and then therefore how much transportation do we need? In Canada, we've jumped over the most important question. And now we're having these skirmishes across the country and avoiding the climate and oil sands pace question.
Very well put.
Right. So, it's a really interesting time in terms of investors and climate and the management of a broader range of environmental and social factors. I think if we look back over the last 10 years, you could really define it as a decade of a push for more corporate transparency on how companies are managing any range of environmental and social issues. And I think what we're entering is an era of a push for more investor transparency on how they're managing these issues. So there's a whole number of examples that you can point to. So the principles for responsible investment were launched in, almost 10 years ago by the UN. There are, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of signatories, including many, many Canadians. And just in September, the PRI launched something called the Montreal Pledge, which is a commitment by different signatories to commit to reporting on the carbon intensity of different portfolios that they're invested in. So to drive more transparency on the issue of, carbon exposure. There is any number of kind of new investment products which are either kind of ex-fossil or low carbon that different investors can invest in. So these are being kind of met with different levels of interest, based on different reasons. And I think you can think about 4 different categories of kind of drivers for an investor to think about climate. The first would be kind of an ethical or moral consideration, particularly for, an environmental NGO with a big, endowment, for example. Is there alignment? The second would be a reputational risk. The third would be, just financial risk. Are these issues important to the bottom line? How can I manage those? And the last would be some kind of regulatory drive. So is there a requirement to report on different things, for example? And actually in Ontario, I believe it's now clear effective January of next year, Ontario regulated pension plans will have to report on whether their statement of investment principles addresses environmental, social, and governance factors. So there are any number of different kind of regulatory catalysts around the world to encourage investors to think about these issues. But in terms of kind of campaigns and the role of activism or NGOs in terms of pushing on investors, we are definitely seeing more of that, particularly in Europe, in the US, and in Australia. And I think we do see campaigns focused on each of those, the first 3 different drivers. So pushing on the reputational issue, pushing the moral or ethical issue, and then pushing on the financial issue. So 350, of course, is well known, and I think pushing more on the moral issue, around are these responsible investments in terms of how we're developing as a society. Green Light is a good example in the UK of more of a financial engagement. So it's a campaign that's being run by something called Share Action. It's a nonprofit focused on responsible investment. And what it's doing is connecting beneficiaries with their pension plans. So there's a website you can go on and say, I'm a steel worker in Birmingham. You can find your pension plan. And then there's a form letter that's written saying, dear pension committee, I've read all this stuff about climate change and how bad it could be, what the financial implications could be, that our economy is going to transform. How are you managing these issues in the context of my pension? Is my pension protected? And if you could let me know what you're doing about that, that would be great. So there's that kind of email, which is a specific campaign that's happening in the UK. So these are being, I think, met sometimes by surprise. Sometimes, different funds aren't sure how to respond. But they are becoming more frequent, and I think people are gearing up in terms of reporting, and it's really, I think, that push towards transparency.
So before I let Brent answer, I'd like we'll move into questions right after this. So if you want to move to the microphones, please do, because we'll take questions right after Brent has had a chance to respond.
Great, thanks. I think I would build on the point that there's a place for all kinds of NGOs and that they have a role to play. And I'm just curious, how many NGOs are in the room right now? Good sign. I know I have a colleague here, Chad, from the Natural Step, and I wanted to highlight a different role that I think NGOs are starting to take, and it's very similar to Quest and what we're trying to do. And what we've stepped out is we're starting to take a really broad range of how we engage stakeholders across Canada. One of the key things that we've tried to do is create a really big tent. And why is that? What we've started to do is try and construct, give a meaningful opportunity for people to have constructive dialogue and discussion. What's really interesting, though, is that to pare this down to a very local level, is that when industry is engaged, and I'll take, for instance, our local utility for some of you. Most of you will probably know that when you get your utility bill. They are experiencing really rapid change in their own business model and thinking. But what they're doing is they're actually starting to reach back out and start to ask, how are we going to operate in this environment? How am I going to work in this community? Do I need to work with that community partner to understand how we locally plan for energy in that community? It's a very different mindset. It's a very different way of thinking about and engaging with communities. And I just want to give quickly three examples of how industry is maybe a different way of approaching how to think about how you can work from the bottom up and getting industry to work with you and think differently. Here in Ontario and in BC, you'll hear the term renewable natural gas. What is that? What does that mean? Really, it's of course biogas or methane that would come from a landfill that would either have to be captured in some format. What industry is trying to do there, as an example, is can you actually inject that and lower the carbon intensity of some of our grids here in Ontario? And they've done it fairly successfully, actually, in a larger scale with the biomass available in BC. And I think it's a good example of how they're starting to respond to the concern and a new market opportunity there. But they've had to work with communities and the regulators and others there to understand how to make that effective. Another example, potentially, going forward, let's say Fort McMurray. Actually, of all the locations, talking about just in terms of the center of what we're having a discussion on, they have launched one of the largest calls for the development of community scale energy in that community. But what they are looking at is the potential to use waste heat capture from local industrial processing that's going on up there. Now, the benefit of that, of course, is that you're trying to capture all that waste steam. The other side is that it's also rapid growth too in that community. So it's understanding how you're going to support what's going on up there. So there's different ways that industry is getting involved, I think, in that conversation. It's something that we're trying to look more regularly across Canada. So I just want to give two examples of a slightly different approach of a bottom-up opportunity for collaboration.
Okay, thank you. And so for the people asking questions, I'd like you to just introduce yourself quickly and try to be clear. If you want a particular person to answer the question, make that clear. Thank you.
Okay, this is a comment, not a question.
Okay.
I'm David Schindler. I'm a Trudeau mentor, and as a mere natural scientist, I guess I've been immunized against the contagion of hope. But I think it's time for a reality check. We not only have the highest CO2 in the atmosphere that we've ever had, we have had the highest rate of annual increase in the last year. So whatever's happening, it's more than countering all of these good things that we're hearing about, which would have been great if we'd started in 1970. And the two biggest per capita emitters in the world that stand way out above everyone else are China and Canada. So that's the reality. We've got to move faster. It's that simple.
Thank you.
I want to say one thing about hope, because I don't know if I really got to it in all of that. Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Schindler. I've been a big admirer for a long time of your work. You know, if you look at the technological changes we've seen in the last 2 years on efficiency, the potential for demand reduction, as well as renewables, it's greater than what we've seen in the last 20. And I am feeling extremely hopeful. And in part, that's because we now know that we have the capacity to dramatically reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, and we're starting to see it at scale around the world. Sometimes it feels in Canada like it's not happening, but it is happening around the world. We've seen, you know, a huge 83% drop in the last 2 years in solar. We now have 144 countries around the world who have renewable energy targets. You know, just even if Canada, one example, if Canada instituted the new vehicle efficiency laws equivalent to what Europe just put in place, that's 85 gram, it's called the 85 gram law. If we had that law in Canada, our new cars, all of them, would use 50% less gas. So that's not hybrids, that's not electrics, there's no change in jobs, there's no change in convenience, it's just cars that use 50% less gas, because we have that technology today. And that, to me, is extremely hopeful.
Okay.
I can just add
Sure.
one more thing. I encourage all of you to look at the Globe and Mail from today. There's a special supplement with an open letter to Stephen Harper, Justin Trudeau, all the leaders, calling for a price on carbon on behalf of all of the different Clean 50 delegates.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sherry Torjman with the Caledon Institute of Social Policy, and my question is for Jane. Jane, you were speaking about the growing interest on the part of Canadians, on the part of investors in green technology and green bonds, and I'm wondering about institutional investors, and more specifically about the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, and that's effectively our money. And to what extent should we be requiring, or have we required, that institutional investor to actually put their huge amount of capital into green technology, and green bonds and other kinds of green investments?
Great. So I guess just for context, when I speak about investors, I am actually speaking about institutional investors, and those are the types of investors that we work with at Mercer. In terms of Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, I would encourage you actually to have a look at their website. They are a signatory to the Principles for Responsible Investment. They actually serve on the Global Advisory Board for the PRI, and I know they've made a number of investments in different types of clean and renewable technologies, as have many other Canadian pension plans. But what we don't see as much in Canada is large institutions necessarily reporting on the portions of their portfolios which are green. So those might be the kinds of developments that would provide, I guess, a specific access to that type of information.
Okay, thank you. That's good.
Is that a comment?
Sure.
Just to build on that, and it goes on our financial conversation this morning a little bit, and it's something that we haven't raised, and I'm hoping over the next 2 days we will. We've talked, one of the significant investments that will happen, and it's depending on who's doing the study. McKinsey has one out, so does Bose, Hamilton, and others, with looking at the level of infrastructure investment that will be required to support our urban growth around the world, which we know is going to be the primary place where most people will be living in the world. So in the next 15 to 20 years, depending on whose timeline you're using, you're looking at anywhere from 350 trillion or more to be invested in new infrastructure. Talk about an investment opportunity to getting policy aligned with a 2-degree opportunity, but it's also just about the fact that that has to happen. It's not the likelihood of investment, it's the investment that will happen. And so getting on board with how you direct that investment to make sure it achieves the kind of built environment that we want and the energy systems we want, now is the time to have that conversation. But we aren't always having that conversation. We go ahead and we continue to plan our roads the same way. We build our energy systems, the water supply systems the same way. That has to change a little bit. We have to get our policy direction in place to make sure that's clear. So as much as it's about the climate change policy as it is in making sure those other policies are working towards that as well. So I just want to show that connection to there. And the other part of our financial conversation about investment, we talked about investors. How about underwriters in terms of insurance? Those who are having to respond now to the impacts. When we've had here, both in Alberta and Toronto, on the outages for a prolonged period of time, it is a huge financial impact and cost, and one that we are paying now. Every insurance company is starting to raise their fees as a response. So I think this is where we're going to see some of these tensions play out as well, as what drivers are they going to create when they won't insure you? And I think that's the other question we haven't raised today is, are we near that? Are we getting to that stage? I'm not sure, but I'd be curious to see some other people who might have comments on that.
On the insurance point, the infrastructure point, I think an interesting development, of course, is the increase in private capital going to insurance investments. So the ability then for private, large institutional investors to actually set some kind of standards around, what are the minimum expectations around climate risk or different environmental standards for the types of projects that they would be willing to invest in. And we're starting to see more discussion about that, and I think you could pretty quickly come up with some global standards per type of infrastructure investment, which just become, baseline. And that would all of a sudden, in the absence of regulatory or policy development from governments or municipalities or whatever, it would kind of override that and say, look, these are the private sector investor minimum standards per type of infrastructure.
Interesting.
So that, with the more engagement of the global financial community, those types of things become possible and quite reasonable to work to achieve.
Yeah, and I should just add that when we talk about the growth of urban development around the world, it's not in the existing Class A cities. It's in all those cities that do not exist that you've never heard the name of yet that are growing at a substantial rate. And they're the ones who have the chance to actually get it right from the outset while we worry and figure out how we're going to retrofit an existing built environment, which is extremely difficult to do.
Right, that's a good point.
Good morning. My name is Brian Davies, and I'd like to add a bit of perspective and ask for your feedback and for the benefit of everyone. One of the reports that was submitted to the Climate Summit in September was a decarbonization pathways. Approximately 15 countries, major emitters around the world, presented their scenarios. Canada was one of those, and the outcome of that was various. But one of the facts in that was that we're looking at right now we're about 23 tons per person per year of CO2, depending whether or not you just add the fossil or take away the land use. But they're talking about us having our footprint reduced to about 2 tons per year by 2050. That's substantial. So I mentioned that and asked for your feedback.
Yeah, sure.
If you look at the pathway that that report is laying out, which is very consistent with a lot of other reports around the world that we've seen for 2050, say IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Council reports, and others, when you talk about personal CO2, it makes it sound like we're all going to be shivering in the dark. But in fact, that's not true. Our carbon per capita is so high because of oil sands production. It's not because of, that we all have to, park our cars and start walking to work. I mean, it's a good idea. As a mother, I think it's good to show children on the options, but I think the larger issue at play is that the single reason that Canada will not meet our climate targets and that we're not on a pathway for reduction is the increased emissions that are coming from the oil sands. Almost every other single sector, especially coal, as a result of the moves that you've made here in Ontario to phase out coal, emissions are going down. So the one sector, the one reason our emissions are going up and our per capita emissions are going up is because of the oil sands. So I think that's right. I think that there's no question. The decarbonization report showed very clearly that we have to dramatically reduce emissions. We have to dramatically reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. But I don't think, I think if you look very closely at some of those reports, you realize that the lifestyle changes, especially with the technologies we have today, are not that significant. I don't think we're going to see dramatic changes. I think we're going to see a dramatic increase in quality of life because you have more livable cities, you have more people getting out of their cars more once they have the infrastructure to do that as a result of the public investment in public transit and bike lanes, etc.
Please.
Hi, everyone. Okay, there we go. I'm Chad Park with The Natural Step, and thanks for great dialogue. I've been thinking a lot and had people talk to me about the word joy as well in this discussion, and I'm glad to see the word hope, and I've been thinking about and having lots of conversations about how we also get the word joy into this conversation. And so with that in mind, I just want to maybe invite you, any of you who want to take up the challenge. I'd like to hear your narrative about Canada's energy future, and I guess I want to challenge to hear the narrative in a way that reflects your sense of joy and hope and connectedness, especially about Canada. And I'm in particular interested in if this narrative can be one that is inclusive, especially of Alberta.
Thank you. A hard question, if there is one.
They're both looking at me like it's...
Well, but it's personal narrative, right? So I think
personal
each of
narrative.
You,
Do you want to start?
Sure.
Okay.
You know what? My joy at the end of the day, and it's a personal one, is I'm 100% behind the hope of smart energy communities across Canada. That's my joy. That's what drives me. That's what gets me up in the morning. That's what gets my team going. And why is that? It's why I started that point right at the beginning, that we half of our, 60% of our energy end use is in communities, 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. You want to get a climate change policy in terms of helping, at the end of the day, respond. One of the biggest ones you can do is making sure that communities who've got community energy plans, there's lots of them, 170 across Canada, representing 50% Canada's population, got a plan. They need some support, direction, and tools to allow them to implement that plan. then you start getting incredible results. That's why I highlighted a couple of them just here in Toronto for you. You start getting those, they add up immense opportunity. Like, because each of us lives somewhere, and we can all have that role, and that joy and that hope is by getting involved. And that's what these have done. And I think that's what today's panel was a little bit about, is we always ask ourselves, what can we do? And we had the 1 ton challenge, and what does that really mean? But at the end of the day, it's also the complexities of the situation, the fact that this is tied to economy and job creation and how you actually pull this all together. Well, at the end of the day, community energy plans, for those who aren't familiar, just give you an example, they really are about economic development. They really are about trying to understand how you're going to address your energy costs, what kind of solutions are available locally. And if we can start to implement them and get them going forward, and they are being implemented, I should clarify that. A lot of them are, and they're actually having good results, like the City of Calgary, like the City of Edmonton. They're actually doing great jobs. Like the City of Calgary, its entire production, and just in this case of energy use in that city for the municipality, is technically what we would consider carbon neutral, at least by purchasing green credits, right? At least they've tried to think about that. The other thing they do is like ride the wind. As an example for the City of Calgary, right? Argumentatively, they often talk about that's their local transit system, right? It equates to the fact that it runs on the amount of wind power that they produce from their own farm that they own. They own their own wind farm, right? Another example, just in the City of Calgary, I'm picking on it because Chad mentioned Alberta. They've also built what I think is a great district energy system, for those who aren't familiar, in the downtown core. And why that was really important with the recent power outage too, resiliency, reliability. They're now looking at making that what they call combined heat and power. Why I'm talking about this, and I'm sorry for the complexity here, I'll make it very simple. The ease of the day, combined heat and power, is production of thermal energy and electricity from one fuel source. 2 for 1. Great efficiency, and when you produce that electricity, you're capturing the waste heat and using it back in your thermal. Almost, but not quite, closed loop. It also depends on the type of fuel you use. All kinds of different choices there. Why is it important? It provides all kinds of benefits for that community downtown. Why? Because they had a plan and they acted on it. Why? Because they wanted to be a leader in terms of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and they are, and they're able to point to it. So that's my joy, that's my hope, and that's my passion at the end of the day.
Sabra?
Thank you for that question. That was fun to think about that for the last couple of minutes. So I imagine a country that leads again, like we did with the Montreal Protocol, a country that we are proud of internationally. I imagine a country that is fully developing our high-tech capacity, our clean-tech capacity, where we are ensuring that our policies help people save money and use less energy and create a more livable and livable cities. I imagine a country where our laws are designed to benefit the majority, where in Alberta we're using the incredible knowledge and skills and workforce to develop geothermal, to develop renewable energy, where we're exporting clean energy instead of exporting oil. I imagine a country where we guarantee Canadians clean, safe jobs at home where they live. And I imagine a country that not only ensures reconciliation with First Nations, but I recently had the incredible opportunity to spend some time with Ellen Gabriel. Many of you will remember her as one of the lead spokespersons for OCA many years ago. She's working on the Energy East pipeline. And she said to me, I said, what is your vision for the future? What are you hopeful about? And she said, all we've ever wanted, and I don't think I'll ever forget this moment, she said, all we've ever wanted is love and peace and respect for our people and for the earth. So my vision of the future is that we'll assimilate you.
Thank you. Jane?
You know, I guess I think about it more from a global perspective, and climate change is, you know, I think the biggest challenge facing our civilization. And, you know, I have 2 little girls, and many of you have kids and grandkids, and I think it's really for them and for the next generations all around the world that is just a huge motivation in terms of thinking about how to address this challenge. And, you know, my hope is that through engaging finance and thinking about it, you know, we're bringing this huge new power horse to help solve a challenge that absolutely requires their engagement. And I think it's the right thing to do, but it's also necessary to protect long-term capital market performance that we address this issue together. And I think, we are in that moment. Finance is engaged. And so it's I think, hugely positive to see that development, and who knows exactly where it will go, but I think it's just at the beginning, which is really very hopeful.
Okay, so I'll ask you to both, actually, if you're able to say your questions, and then we'll ask the panelists to answer both at the same time. And then I just want to say there's going to be a break, and then there's going to be the breakout from 10:30 to 12, and then lunch at 12 in the same room where we had breakfast. So please.
Hi, I'm Vince, and I am one of a million continuous improvement professionals in North America. And as a professional in this area, I like to learn from failure. One failure that's been very motivational for me is looking at the Australian carbon tax and why it failed. It failed for two reasons. One, because it got repealed, and another because it only mitigated and decarbonized at a rate of 0.86%. But in order to be successful to accomplish our 2-degree goals, it would need to be able to decarbonize at a rate of 5.1%. Now, those numbers come from PricewaterhouseCoopers. So my question is, how can we empower continuous improvement professionals to help us actually hit a 5% target instead of a 1% target? And does that actually look like having carbon data throughout an entire supply chain, so a continuous improvement professional knows where to strike to decarbonize that supply chain?
Hi there, my name's Tom Travinsky. I'm from Canadians for Clean Prosperity, and one of the real challenges that we're struggling with, and I think the whole movement is struggling with, is elections in this country are fought over economic-minded voters on the center right often, who are trying to figure out how these issues will impact their pocketbooks. And at the end of the day, how do we speak to those kinds of people so that we don't spend our time talking? I assume most people in this room already, we're here because we get it. How do we reach out and spread the contagion of hope to those audiences so that we can start to coalesce a political consensus on this rather than dividing across it?
Okay, so brief thoughts and concluding thoughts on these two questions from our panelists.
I'll start. I think, to take your question first, Tom, I think we have to stop talking about these issues as though they are a burden. We have to, that it's a tax, it's a burden, it's a, I'll never forget when right after the green shift, Stefan Dion flailing, I'm going to run a prime ministerial campaign on calling for a tax moment. I actually had a conversation with the Prime Minister of Denmark, because of course they have a very high price on carbon in Denmark, $70 a ton I think now, and I said to him, how did you do it? Like we can't seem to get anywhere in Canada nationally on this. And he looked at me like I was kind of crazy, and he said, well, civil society demanded it, I didn't have a choice, which I found extremely interesting. I think that, and I think that if you look at the polling on these issues, we're there in Canada. Consistently, even during the economic downturn, Canadians believe in climate change, they want clean energy, they believe in putting a price on pollution. But again, that's a better way of framing it, right? A price on pollution, making polluters pay, which I've seen Canadians for Clean Prosperity do extremely well. I think we also have to acknowledge and you did it today, Jane, what fossil fuels have given us. We have this lifestyle, and because of the fossil fuel era, and that's over now. Okay. That the fact is we are moving away from the fossil fuel era. The world is moving to a low carbon economy, and it will do it by design or default. And we will either be in a position where we're having to catch up in Canada or not. And I think that we need to start talking about it that way. We need to stop pointing fingers at ourselves because of our lifestyles and at people who work in the oil sands, and instead start having a collective conversation about how we move forward given the knowledge that we currently have and the new technologies and the market conditions, etc. And so I think we need to start having a collective conversation. And I'm sure from some people that's hard to hear from me, considering I run environmental campaigns on pipelines. But I do want to say that it is in large part the confrontation and the polarization that's happening in Canada right now emerges from government's not only failure to act, but attacks on anyone who has environmental concerns as extremists and radicals, etc. And, you know, we have to stop pointing fingers and you know, what's that term on destroying the messenger, or,
Right,
you know,
shooting messenger.
thank you, shooting the messenger.
Destroying messenger.
And start having a real conversation and take those concerns seriously, and really start addressing them. And I think that will help us move forward. And on the pricing question, I will just say that we do have one of the best examples in the world of a carbon tax that is working. British Columbia's carbon tax has spurred innovation. It's dramatically reduced CO2s. There's a number of amazing reports, Sustainable Prosperity and others who have done incredible reports on this. We have a great example of something that is working economically and environmentally, and we should be expanding it across the country.
And so, yeah, please, thank you. So we do need to conclude, but please, your thoughts on the questions or anything else?
I guess just quickly, I agree, we need a reframing. You know, it's not green growth versus jobs. It's, you know, how do we evolve into the low carbon economy in a kind of prosperous and effective and fast way. And so I think, you know, if you look at media coverage in Canada, for example, of a lot of the developments in the finance community and even in the business community around the climate summit, you know, Canadian media is not covering it as well as many other markets, which I think is contributing to a lack of awareness among a lot of Canadians that it's not, you know, a one or the other. It's you know, this is the path we're down. There are a lot of opportunities. It's really interesting and exciting, and I think if we start to have more narrative around that, I think we'll get more engagement, which I think will have a kind of positive reinforcement cycle. So I think everything that everyone in this room can do to encourage that, I think would be incredibly useful.
Right. I don't have anything more than to echo the same thing. We have to give ourselves permission to talk about it. We have to decide that it's okay to talk about it. And then you actually can talk about it. And until you actually decide that, then it's kind of hard to get going because then it gets politicized, right? And I think if we all decided across Canada, and I think a lot of those NGOs we asked about their role and others, that's a great role, right? It's okay. Bring it out to talk about. And let people understand what the choices are. These are trade-offs. These are, we hadn't talked about it, but it comes back to this big term, energy literacy, people love to throw around. But part of that is just allowing people to have discussions and understand the energy trade-offs that we're making and allow us to become self-informed. And that's what really drives democracy, and that's what really, at the end of the day, drives choice for people. And I think if we can get to that stage, which we are, and I think that's what's changed and that's what you're starting to see, even industry in their own sense, I think, has come around a little bit saying, let's get out there. I think it's time to have these conversations more. And I think that's a really good time, and I hope that we do. And I think all of us have a responsibility to encourage that in our own way. So when you asked about the role for continuous professionals, it's making that conversation happen, raising it yourself. And I think that's where we can have it.
Thank you all, and I'd like to, encourage everyone to also thank our panelists.
Thank you on our behalf also. So everybody, now, Brent, you talked about some very interesting examples of resilience and innovation at the community level. People who want to hear Brent talk more about that, just stay right here in this room. He's going to be joined by Mary McDonald of the World Wildlife Federation. Jane, you're going to be talking to Paul Kovacs of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. So we were talking earlier about insurers and how they're adapting and coping and so forth. If you want to hear Jane and Paul, you can go upstairs to the university ballrooms at the end of this hall and up one flight. And Sephora is going to be upstairs in the roof salon. Everybody here knows the roof bar. Well, it's not the bar, but it's the salon next door. Beautiful place. She'll be talking with Ross Beatty of Pan American Silver on citizen engagement. Let us all thank our panelists one more time.